Good morning and welcome to the special council meeting of the District of Lunenburg. It's Wednesday, September the 3rd, and welcome to those who are in the gallery and those who may be watching on YouTube this morning. I would like to acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people, which we share with gratitude with them. I would ask that we have an addition to the agenda, if somebody could do that, regarding public input. And we have agreed this morning. In the past, public input wasn't part of the agenda for special meetings, but from here on, we are going to make sure that it is, particularly because there will be give the public opportunity for questions after our presentation. So I would ask if somebody could move the public input be added to the agenda as 3.12, I think would be it. Moved by Councillor Hubley and seconded by Councillor Bell. All those in favor signify by raising their hands. Motion is carried unanimously. So we will have an opportunity for public input after the presentation, which I think in some cases will make perhaps some of your questions may be clarified, and for those who may be watching us on YouTube, you'll have a chance. You can either perhaps even call, or if you're watching and want to drop in, you can come by and ask your questions. So with that, we will move to staff report, which is Planning and Development Services. Mr. Shepherd and Anna are with us for municipal-wide planning, land use planning, zoning framework. And this is part of a series of special sessions we've had for council to dig in a bit deeper to some of the areas which posed most of the discussion when we met with the public in the late spring. And this also provides a reference piece for the public to get more information on what is behind zoning, what's included in it, how we view it. And I think we'll find it quite useful in our understanding of how this might apply as we go forward. And also an opportunity for us to provide our planning folks with some input as to our thoughts around this. So I'll turn it over to Reed and Anna.
Thank you very much. So Anna and I are here this morning to give quite a lot of information that really focuses on the structure of kind of zones and largely kind of looking at the draft number 1 and how that is structured. And so that's something that council can take away. We'll be coming back talking about what the public said during the public engagement process next month in October. And then in November, we'll be bringing forward several points for council's consideration that will help provide the direction for draft number 2. So this is helping to, I think, inform that conversation. That public input piece will also, I think, help inform the direction that you'd like to provide us. So we don't worry about giving us all of the feedback on this today. You can certainly provide some of that. We're taking notes, but when it comes to, thinking about things that you do or don't want to see in that next draft, we'll have specific conversations about that in November as well. So getting into kind of what zoning is, when we talked about municipal-wide land use planning, most people would be most familiar with zoning and the concept of that. So it's really about regulating different types of land uses. Often that's done by dividing different areas into different zones. And traditionally those zones have focused on different types of land uses. So a lot of people would think of, some of those extremes. So, heavy industry and having a zone where that types of use is allowed, and then residential where that type of use is allowed, but not having those two things in the same area. Zoning and land use planning and all of that, the origins of planning and zoning really came out of kind of industrialization in Europe, and seeing kind of the results of people living in really kind of polluted environments, and realizing that there should be some separation of those kinds of uses. Nowadays, those types of really, when people think of industrial uses and things like that, that are probably more in our past, it's more focused on kind of grouping things together and planning out things in a more orderly manner that are focused on things like environmental protection, transportation, walkability, things like that. So why zoning is important today is about it gives you the opportunity to dictate or say how you want the community to grow. You can focus on things like safety, predictability. It can help protect property values by giving people the certainty about what is and isn't allowed. As I mentioned, there's abilities to protect the environment, supporting businesses, and helping maintain character of places. So it gives the community, gives councilors, decision makers the ability to direct where new development should go, and by setting kind of the bigger goals and then outlining that through zoning. So we often talk about the two kind of primary documents that have been involved in this. One is the municipal planning strategy. That's where you talk about these are the things that we want to achieve. And then the land use bylaw is the rules and how kind of carrying out that vision. And so it's kind of saying, these are our goals, these are our vision, and then the land use bylaw and the zones are the implementation of that. So in the work that we've done on the staff side in the preparation of the first draft, there are some kind of general kind of guiding principles, I guess you could say, that we used in the creation of that. So these are just highlighting some of those guiding tools that we used in the preparation of that draft. So one was flexibility, and that's about things like the number of types of uses in a zone, the ability to do the certain amount of density, things like that, as a key component. Another piece being to ensure that existing uses could continue, not only as what people would think of as non-conforming or grandfathered, but actually as without any type of restriction in the future. So one of the components of this draft is there's kind of one line or one type of use that's in one of these permitted use tables that basically says if you had a use that there was a new zone that came into place and you had that existing use there, maybe it's a business and it's a residential zone, for whatever reason, if that business was no longer considered as a permitted use in that residential zone, the way that this is written, and this is taking a good example from some other municipalities in the province, that use on that property could continue as if it were listed as a permitted use. So it's not constrained by, you know, the inability to expand or grow or whatnot. Most zones in this have a provision that says if that use was there legally to begin with, it can continue as if it was continued to be permitted without any restriction. So you can expand, you can close it up and restart it, whatever it is. So it's more, that's more flexibility. Most bylaws don't have that ability. That was a unique piece that we kind of looked to. East Hants actually has a similar provision in their bylaw.
Yeah, can we just pause there, because I think this is a really important element of this. So, Councillor Moore.
Thank you. So you're saying that if there is, okay, let me try to think of some business. If there was a business that's existing and they are grandfathered, non-conforming, whatever, and passed, and they're allowed to continue the way they were, but if they wanted to expand a lot, does the new rules of the bylaw, are they implemented in that expanded area?
Mostly, yes.
Okay.
So most of the time, so when, for example, when we talked about things like, you know, most land use bylaws would have zones that say, and there's a provision in there that says what a non-conforming use is. Most of the time, those are implemented in the way that if that use is not permitted in that new zone, it's fine as it is, but they can't expand. And if it closes for a period of time, you can't reopen it. So there's limits around that. And the reason for that is that zone, what you're aiming to do is down the road, that gradually gets phased out. You know, it's not really, that's not the intention of that zone. If it's a residential zone, it's not intended to be industrial forever. So, but you're also giving the people that have that business their opportunity. You're not telling them they need to close it down or anything, but you're limiting what they can do. This approach says, let's be more flexible on that and saying when there is that use that exists, this special provision that's in there says if that use is lawfully existing as of that new bylaw, it's basically considered a permitted use in that zone on that property. So you can expand it. You can have the same rights as anyone as if it were permitted in that zone. I'm not aware of a whole lot of places that have that, but we found that we felt like that was a good approach, particularly for a lot more of the kind of general kind of rural and residential areas in our municipality, where there really is a mix of different types of uses, but you still want to kind of outline, go a certain direction. So if you want to say this is generally a residential area, but there might be a kind of handful of businesses in there, how do you approach that? This gives you that ability to say, okay, well, if there's nothing on the property, then going forward, it's going to be residential. But if there is a small business that's there, and small business isn't generally permitted in this area, then there's nothing stopping them from expanding and going about their business. It's an added flexibility compared to most bylaws.
Did that answer, Councillor Moore? You're still looking a little puzzled.
I am.
Do you want to come back to it?
Can I just have one more?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, say someone has they're in a residential area and they want to open on their property a garage and do some body work or mechanical work. The provisions will be distinguished in what zone it's in, right? So if and when this all comes to be and it's passed and everything in 7 years, that was a joke, not really. So that person could not do that, open a garage for, like, say, a retirement income or something like that. Is that what you're saying?
It all depends on what that zone is.
Right.
So what we'll get into today is talking about all those different types of zones that are in the first draft. Now, there's different approaches to everything.
Right.
But generally, the vast majority of our municipality makes sense, I think, to most people, that needs to be in some sort of rural zone. And that rural zone would be very flexible
Yeah.
and would permit uses like that.
Okay. I like the word very flexible. Thank you.
Councillor Oikel, and we'll try to keep our questions at this point to this particular point, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions as we go. Okay, Councillor Oikel.
Okay, so if I'm in a residential area and I have a little store, and it's permitted, obviously, so you're saying then I can add on to my little store, a little farmer's market, I can add on a greenhouse, right? That's what you're saying, because my little store was there to begin with.
We're talking hypotheticals here.
Yeah, yes, hypothetical.
Now, we're talking about a hypothetical where the zone is quite restrictive and it's saying only residential uses. But there happens to be this general store or whatnot. If it were a different type of use that they were trying to add on, that does change it. This is saying that use itself is not, limited by expansion or anything. So if the store says, oh, we're expanding, we're adding on, but it's still that same type of use, then this provision would allow them to do that without any issue.
So for clarification, I have my little store, it's a grocery store, and then my husband decides he wants to open a garage with a gas station, total different.
Yes,
Change of
correct.
the use, okay.
Change of
I
use.
just want to make sure, so it has to relate to what was already there. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Smith.
And just to clarify, if you have a business in a zone that the business is not permitted normally, and you sell it, does the grandfathered use continue with that business with the new owner, or does it go away?
In that case, regardless of whether this special provision exists or not, that's always the case. It's really based on the use and the property. Ownership plays no role in that.
Okay, let's move on, and that was a really important point to get clarification around. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So that's an example of the flexibility component. Another approach here that we used was Anna and our former staff member Corinne spent a whole summer going out throughout the municipality, kind of documenting what types of uses existed. Now this is, they're not knocking on doors or anything, but going around to all the roads and driving throughout the municipality and trying to understand what uses existed. So the zoning and the zone maps and things that exist are influenced by that. But what we didn't want to try to do was to say, okay, there's a welding business here, and there's a body shop here, and here's a residential here, and to try to zone those to fit into a certain zone category. Because we also don't know really what happens on those properties, and we don't know what people want to do in the future. So when I say community-based zoning versus property by property, the idea is here, we did not try to, find all the light industrial properties and zone them light industrial, or find all the heavy industrial, or find all the fishery-related things. So the idea is you want to make sure people have that flexibility, because when you put them in a certain zone, if that is maybe more restrictive in some way, you want to ensure that they don't have a whole lot of limitations on what they can do, because we don't know where all of those businesses are. We have thousands of properties. It would be very, very difficult to kind of find the perfect zone that works for everyone and put them in that now. It's really about setting the stage for the future, and when people want to do something different, we have a framework for that. So the flexibility is important if you're using that approach to ensure that things that are there, if they don't perfectly fit the mold of that zone, they're not super limited in what they can do. The piece about being equitable and non-discriminatory, there's a lot of discussion, particularly right now, about housing, affordable housing, the need for housing. So this approach here really tried to stay away from categorizing types of dwellings, for example. So townhouses, multi-unit buildings, semi-detached, duplexes, garden suites, backyard suites, basement suites. So most land use bylaws categorize all those different types of things, and what that allows them to do is to say, we permit townhouses over here, and we permit garden suites over here, and so they have all these different residential zones, and they can pick and choose what types of dwellings. Our approach here was to not get into that. We haven't tried to create a definition and zone for all these different types of dwellings. All we tried to do was create a kind of density. So it doesn't matter how many, or it doesn't matter what it looks like, it's really about how many units are there, and you're using that as a basis for how we would want to do approval. So if there's a certain amount of units, whether it's kind of 5 or whether it's 10 or if it's 50, that's what matters. It's not about what it looks like, because that can just create, I think in our view, a lot of complexity that in a rural community, the things to look at when you're looking at development really are there potential impacts? Is there enough servicing? Servicing is one of the most important ones for us because we don't have a lot of water and sewer. So it's really about ensuring that there is a real difference between 50 units and 5 units in how you treat wastewater and drinking water, for example. That's really kind of what the focus is on this approach. And so in doing that, this approach looks at things like kind of establishing thresholds. So the residential is an easy one because council's already established cluster development kind of policies and regulations. It uses that same type of threshold. So the five units is kind of used as that general threshold. So kind of it's taking that same approach where if you go beyond that, if you're looking at 6 units, whether or not it's a cluster development, this kind of takes that same approach where we would want to look at a higher level of approval the more units you go. In the case of different types of, whether it's industrial or large scale commercial, you can use square feet as the way of kind of looking at the scale of that type of development. And once you go beyond a certain size, you may want to have a different approval process. So you can have as of right, you can have to the other end of the spectrum, which is you have to do a plan amendment or you need to do a development agreement. So it's trying to use scale, whether it's the intensity of use, whether it's the number of units, the gross floor area, whatever it is, as a way to, increasingly kind of have a closer look at developments, just whether they're large scale or small scale. That's the approach of the zone, basically. So in the municipal planning strategy document, that's that policy document. One of the requirements in that document is that you have what's called a generalized future land use map, or GFLUM. That basically kind of creates the basis for zones. So we're still talking about the policy document here, but it kind of creates, you're saying that these are the types of general types of things we want to see in the future. So it's designations is what they're called in this document. And that kind of either reflects existing things or identifies what the intended future use is. The way that the municipal planning strategy document works is that generally you have these designations, and then you would categorize, you have different zones that would be permitted within a designation. As it says there, the designations must align with the policies and direction contained in the MPS, and then the zones must be permitted when you have that designation. And that allows you to kind of outline, as an easy example is the environmental designation. That's kind of signifying that you don't intend for those areas to be developed in the future. If somebody wanted to do something different there, they'd need to change that designation. They wouldn't only need to do a zoning amendment or a land use bylaw amendment. They'd actually need to change the designation. That gives council the opportunity to actually say, no, right at the outset. So there's different levels of control you can have by using designations to kind of have a higher level overview, and then we'll get into the zones as well.
Councillor Hubley.
I just have a quick question when I'm looking at this map. Is the environmental designation Crown land?
Most of it is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Okay.
what's shown here would be Crown land, as well as municipal, or kind of land trust types of lands. What you don't see here are a little piece of privately owned lands that would be where there's a designated under the Beaches Act as well. Yeah, so that's a different category. But we'll drill into a little bit more detail when we talk about the conservation zone too. So kind of the next tier is the zones. And so you're looking at a big list there. So these are kind of divided up into different types of areas. So we have kind of a mixed use growth center area, what we called hamlets in this draft. We have kind of a lot of rural areas, some residential rural, and then we have some that are related to protected watersheds and drinking water protection. Recreation and parks, that's a kind of an obvious one. And then we have several zones that aren't shown here because they're introduced in this plan, but kind of what I was talking about before with the idea of we don't know where these different types of uses that might be general commercial or heavy industrial. And the idea is those are to be used going forward, not necessarily to say like, well, you might have this type of use on your property, so we're going to put a light industrial zone there. And not really understanding whether that person really wants that zone in place there or not. But to have the structure there, so going forward, when people are looking at these types of uses, then establishing those appropriate types of zones for the future. So it basically breaks down those designations into different types of zones. Now, in terms of what we've heard so far, our staff are going to bring forward a really comprehensive what we heard report from the public engagement. But I will make a few comments. We'll make some comments throughout this where we've clearly identified through some of the analysis so far, what are some of the comments that we've heard. And I'm sure those of you that have been at a lot of those engagements wouldn't be surprised by any of these. But in terms of some general comments about the zones, there's been some general sentiment. Residents want kind of minimum requirements. One of the themes that's been clear, however, in saying that is that residents also don't want a one-size-fits-all approach. So people have pretty consistently said they want the policies and regulations kind of tailored to fit the context of their communities. We didn't get a whole lot of comments on the specific zones. Most of the conversation was focused on the general provisions section of these. So that general provisions kind of outline types of regulations that apply across the board, as opposed to saying, okay, well, here's this conservation zone and here's the different uses permitted in that. And I either like or don't like or want to see some changes to that. They were more focused on those kind of other things like small businesses, agriculture, and those are pieces that are contained in that different section. So as I was mentioning about the kind of proportion of lands that kind of would fall into these different categories, I could say about 80% with this draft fall into either the rural general or the rural agriculture potential zone. Those two zones are very, very similar. They actually have the exact same permitted uses contained within them. And that would, in total, would equal 80% of all of the land within the municipality. And then you have a whole bunch of other zones that make up the rest. The next kind of biggest one there will be Lakeshore residential at 10%. And then we have, those protected water areas, conservation, and then a few smaller areas contained within hamlets as well. I'll turn it over to Anna for this next piece.
So now we're going to get into more zone specifics. We're going to start with the growth center designation. So as we previously mentioned, there are certain designations with zones that fit within each designation. So the growth center designation is applied to centrally located areas in the municipality that have access to municipal water and wastewater. There's potential for growth and development intensification. So you think of the area around Cookville here. Provides commercial and institutional services and residents and visitors. So like the service hubs of the municipality. So the only zone that was put in that designation is the mixed-use service zone. So this zone is shown on the map there in the pink color. So it's basically all the areas that are currently unzoned of the Osprey Village area in Cookville. And again, that's centrally located areas with access to municipal services such as centralized water and wastewater.
Can I,
Oh, sure.
can I just get you to pull your mic a little
Yeah.
closer?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay,
That's
thank-
better. So these areas require more density in terms of residential uses and then mixed-use development. They permit a range of land uses, so large-scale commercial uses like box stores, residential and institutional uses, among others. And then for this zone, there was proposed a minimum density requirement for residential developments. So 25 units per hectare, so 2.47 acres. Onto the hamlet.
And then the next kind of designation.
Can I just,
Sure. Yep.
not to complicate it, but how does that designation, mixed-use service zone, fit into the village of Hebville? Hebville has a secondary planning strategy, but the implications going forward, I don't know, I don't want to overcomplicate it, but that's going to be a question from our residents in Hebville about how these designations relate to their particular area, because it is a growth area. It will continue to be, and going forward, this will be one of the areas I think we'll have a lot of conversation about, given that there's already some infrastructure there.
Yeah, that's probably one of the best kind of examples, beyond this particular location that presents kind of a growth opportunity. This was kind of looking at existing serviced areas that have that capability to support 25 units per hectare of residential growth. And this is really trying to mimic this kind of existing Osprey Village plan area regulations. It's really trying to just be kind of quite close to what exists there and expand it out to encompass the areas around Walmart and across the road as well. Thinking about a community like Hebville, that there's different options there. This could be, an option. There's another zone that we'll talk about called a comprehensive development district, which is an approach that kind of places almost a hold on an area that says, okay, we need to actually we want to develop this, but it needs to be done in a comprehensive manner. So you can't come in and just make an application to do something. It needs to be developed with a whole plan in place with servicing and everything. But basically, we wouldn't necessarily want to put something in place that says we want to have a minimum density of residential development in this area, but not having the infrastructure to support that. I think similarly, there was just an amendment kind of completed for Osprey Village to remove that requirement from a piece that's further down Harold Wynot Road, because we recognize that doesn't have servicing and it's unlikely to have it. So I guess we wouldn't want to necessarily kind of signify to people that we want to see a lot of density in a place like Hebville without having that servicing plan in place yet. So we would want to kind of have the servicing plan and the zoning kind of work hand in hand, and maybe bring that in as a part of, establishing a new servicing area and say, this is the zoning we're going to have. But we might be getting the cart ahead of the horse.
We've got a couple of questions related to this, but just as a comment, I know that in the meeting that was held in Hebville, there was some confusion about secondary planning strategies and the relationship between what we were trying to do through a planning strategy and how that fit in. So I know these kind of questions are going to come up. I think the explanation, and I think the residents of Hebville, as probably Wildville and maybe Dayspring to a certain extent, because they abut onto this, where there's service components from the town, for example, that we could see, over time, people are going to gravitate to those areas. From a development point of view, there'll be pressure from developers to look at how we can service those areas. So I think there are going to be a lot of questions related to that. So Councillor Bell and then Councillor Oikle.
Thank you. My comment comes from your fifth bullet there, where you use the word hectare. Is that an accepted professional standard used in planning documents as opposed to acreage or acre? I say that because when Long Lake Fire started, I found the province having to explain what a hectare was to most of the people who live in Aurora area, and they associate acreage as opposed to hectarage. So that's a question.
Yeah, that's a great question. The kind of, I guess the answer to the first part is yes, that most documents would use metric as the measurement. I think I can't picture a hectare in my own head. I can picture an acre. I believe it's 2.47 acres per hectare. So it's a fair amount larger than what an acre is. One of the options that we can do in those drafts going forward is to include, in brackets, the imperial conversion beside a lot of these numbers. I think the kind of I would say best practice would be that we use metric as the kind of baseline, but in terms of explaining to people who are used to using feet and acres and things like that, we can certainly have that shown beside it just so they know in their own head.
In the effort to making it a friendly document, I think including the brackets would help a long ways for many people.
Councillor Oikle.
Thank you. As the municipal councillor for the Hebville area, so the Hebville area does have now its secondary planning document, and what we're doing will have no bearing on that. That document will still be in place. All the areas that are presently zoned, I understand, will still be what they are zoned. Once this document is finished, it will still be the same, correct?
Yes, there's a big caveat with that. There are kind of 2 to 3 items in draft number 1 that within the bigger plan would kind of supersede what's in this local secondary plans. So one of them is cluster development. One of them is coastal protection measures. Those were introduced to override any, if it's whatever's the most strict. So for example, like if in Oakland, they had a building elevation that was 4 meters minimum, and the coastal protection said 3.97, then Oakland's plan requirement would supersede the municipal wide one. It wasn't that case. The municipal wide one is a stricter standard. So those are the two. The other one that's in draft number 1 relates to wetlands in watercourses. In that the way that it's written in the plan, and that can be changed, is that where there aren't, where that basically says the secondary planning policies will prevail or will apply except for these specific things. And here's a list: cluster, coastal, as well as watercourse and wetland setbacks.
Follow up, if I may, Mayor? Thank you. And so I did notice that in their secondary planning that there is nothing necessarily around the lakes in that planning, I don't believe. And that when we do zoning around the lakes, that would supersede whatever would be in, if it was more than what is in their planning document, as well as, there is no coastal in Hebville. But whatever area, I just want to make sure, whatever area now is considered residential, whatever area is considered industrial or commercial use will remain after all of this is done. That's their main concern.
Yeah, I can confirm, absolutely. Ultimately, it's council's decision, but what's in this draft, none of us really want to get into making changes to those zones. So what's in draft number 1 is all the existing plans, secondary plans, and the zones within those plans, the permitted uses, the lot size requirements, setbacks, with the exception of watercourses and wetlands, would be whatever's in that secondary plan today. Yeah. And the intention would be those secondary plans, they would form part of this document almost as an appendix or a chapter at the end. So, you know, they don't exist as independent plans anymore. They would be part of it, but all of those zones would be the same as they are today. Now, there are some older plans, and planning documents have to be reviewed after a period of time. We have several that are beyond their kind of review time, and we need to kind of, once this plan is in place, start into those plans to update them and kind of modernize them and make sure that they're consistent with what's here, simplify things, and that would be a conversation to have with that specific community at that time.
And just for our information, what would be, do you know which plans are out of date?
Hebville's older. Jeff is going to know it's off the top of his head, but I believe Riverport, I think, is the oldest. Yep, that would be number one on the kind of a list to start with.
Okay.
Sure. Okay. So the next piece here was to look at creating what have been called in this plan hamlets, and that's to try to identify where there are kind of well-defined communities. And this is a tricky exercise to figure out where some of those communities start and stop. I think in our head and the community, different people may have different conceptions of what would be considered under this type of designation. So I think there's a lot more discussion required here and a lot more refinement from all of our perspectives with this whole approach here. But the intention is to, there's probably some easier examples, is to try to find where are those more well-defined areas that are built up compared to the area surrounding them. New Germany is definitely the number one on that list to say what is what are those well-defined communities that have different types of uses, residential, commercial, some light industrial. Then there's other ones like La Have and Petite Riviere. And then there's several others that were in that first draft that were really tricky to figure out, should it be in or should it be considered not. And some of that, I think, really it is where we want more discussion from the community about what they may want. And if they don't want to be considered a hamlet or whatever other term, then that's fine too. But it's very difficult to define where some of these start and stop. But the idea is identifying these areas as these are commercials, there's services, there's community hubs that they serve a different purpose, and they function differently than the rural areas around them. You have more density, you have a mix of uses. In some cases, some of them are suited for growth and and more services in the future. So not growth in the sense that you could see big multi-unit developments like we can support here or maybe in Hebville, but you could, if there was things like affordable housing or things like more frequent transit service, those are the things where you want to say, well, where should that serve? Where should those things go? If you're going to provide a service, what are those communities, and trying to identify them through this process, and then down the road, that gives you that ability to kind of say, well, we've defined some of these areas. Here's all the different characteristics of them. The community says this is kind of where they are. They may have things like sidewalks. They may have some of those other features that you don't have in a general rural area. They also give you the ability to, in some cases, if there's really unique historical aspects of these communities, to kind of help define what that is. You can do different types of things under the kind of heritage side of things, which is not included in this, but around preserving and enhancing the heritage aspects of a lot of the communities, because a lot of them are very historical and have a lot of, you know, beautiful architecture and things like that. So this is kind of a way of signifying this is a community, and this is the name of that community, and this is where the edges of that are, and also it gives you more about thinking in the future, the ability to focus on those places about where to see growth and where to see investments and things like that.
Councillor Moore.
Thank you. So under a hamlet designation, would the same rules apply as before, like for the whole planning document? What already exists can stay existing? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and just to clarify, and yes, the answer would be that would be the approach for those areas as well. So kind of further to that, within that designation, the draft one has two zones. So one is a hamlet center zone. That's kind of what when you'd picture kind of what's a main street look like in these communities, that's trying to put that zone in those areas. So small scale retail, institutional, residential, tourist accommodations. It's really kind of what's the center of these. Some of them have a more defined main street than others, but that's the idea behind the hamlet center zone. And then the hamlet residential kind of fills in the other areas around that. It's your side streets that have residential along them primarily. But this approach would say, you know, it wouldn't permit those bigger industrial types of uses. So it would create a more defined. This is one of those few places where you'd say agriculture and large-scale agriculture, large-scale industrial activities wouldn't be permitted in these areas. So that's a choice that you can make around these types of zones and whether you want to go that way. Just as an example in terms of showing what some of those look like in that kind of draft map, New Germany is there. You can see the HR as Hamlet Residential and HC as Hamlet Center. And then kind of along the coast, we've got Vogelers, Broad Cove, and Petite shown as well.
One of your comments on Hamlet Center was that there's usually a designated main street, but New Germany would never ever fit under that because our main street is not a main street, it's a trunk 10. And so that puts us to the side also, that we shouldn't have too much. Okay, thanks.
Councillor Smith.
I was just wondering about, protecting features in hamlet centers. And you said about like historical features, maybe. Could those also be like trees? I know in the past that communities have struggled to protect certain trees that maybe have historical value in their villages. I'm thinking of the maples in New Germany. Like if you were to think of like something that really gives the character of that of Trunk 10 in the center of that hamlet. And I know that there were some ash trees, I think, in Petite Riviere a few years ago that were under threat of being cut, and people felt like they had historical significance. Is that something that can fit within a designation like this, or as far as like heritage trees, I think is what cities would be looking at.
Right. Not directly. I would say the answer to that is it wouldn't fit directly within kind of the parameters of what you could include in the land use bylaw. In how you describe some of these areas, yes, I think that because those are defining features. Now there is a lot more you can do with a heritage designation or a district, and there are, characteristics like the natural landscape of areas that can help define what a heritage district or area is. So there's a lot more you can do on the heritage side about kind of identifying what is it that makes this place special or unique or historical. But I think it does also, this kind of is complementary to doing that by kind of defining and saying this is a place that's special. And this is maybe a main street that is different from the areas around it, or however you want to describe it. And in some cases, you might want to say, okay, and we also want to look at the heritage of it, and in describing that heritage through a more of the heritage bylaw route, there are these trees and these other natural and built features that would kind of encompass that and provide some level of protection there.
Councillor Moore.
A quick one. And if that did come into place, and it was designated as heritage and da-da-da, what does that mean, though, when you've got your DOT right-of-way? Do they have to comply with our planning and our documents and what we deem as heritage?
Generally, no. I would just, the Province kind of does what they what they want. Yes, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so now moving on to the rural designation. So this designation is intended to support the rural lifestyle, rural activities, and to maintain the rural current state of the majority of the municipality without extensive controls, while ensuring that sensitive ecosystems are still protected and that certain types of land uses or unsuitable forms of development, such as high-density developments or sprawl, are sort of geared towards the other areas of the municipality. And then zones included in this designation include the rural general zone, the rural agricultural potential zone, the rural residential zone, and the lakeshore residential zone. And then just thinking about those 4 zones and how much land is encompassed by those zones, it's about approximately 90% of all lands in MODL would fall under this designation, so most of the land. And then just a point on what we've heard so far from the public. People do seem to want flexibility in the rural areas with minimal land use controls. And then also people feel that these parts should be left rural, and then, limiting sprawl and maintaining that important rural character that currently exists. So the first zone, which is about 60% of the land in MODL, is the rural general zone. So this zone is intended to preserve rural character by accommodating a wide range of rural-based land use activities. So this zone is the most lenient compared to all the others. It's applied to lands that are either undeveloped, low density, associated with resource-based activities, or lands that have not been identified as having substantial agricultural potential. And then it permits lower density residential development, a wide range of other land uses, including natural resource related land uses, commercial, industrial, institutional land uses, and many more. So then there's a map here, just an example. So it was hard to capture which areas we wanted to show because most of the land in MODL is zoned this zone. But the white or gray or beige areas of the map there are just showing that that's what the R1 zone would look like. There are speckles of the Lakeshore residential, which are indicated there in green, but this slide is intended to sort of highlight the gray areas. So that's Cruisetown, Middlewood, and Baker's Settlement there.
Councillor Weichel.
Thank you. So when you say low density, does that mean that somebody couldn't put in, if they wanted to put in a trailer park, or if they wanted, because they had lots of land, or they wanted to put in a campground? Would that mean that they couldn't do that in there?
Campgrounds are sort of covered off there's another zone that accommodates campgrounds and RV parks. So we'll get to that a bit later.
But within a residential, because a lot of our residential land is many hectares of land, right? That is way far off in the middle of the woods or whatever, right? And a person could decide that they want to do a glamping type of a thing, right, in the middle, right, which would nobody be around. So I'm asking if in rural general area R1, if, because you had low density, a campground is not, is higher density. Would that be allowed? Or does that then have to be, that little piece of land have to be then rezoned to be a campground? Is that what you're saying?
If it was specifically a campground, it would have to go through rezoning to the recreational commercial zone. But I think in that case, it would really depend on the use. We're speaking hypothetically, but if it was specifically a campground, there's a zone that would require a campground to be rezoned. But if it was tourist accommodations or something that wasn't necessarily a campground or RV park, then that would be allowed in this zone. So it really is dependent. Yeah.
Just to add to what Anna was saying, these are the types of areas where people would most likely want a campground. So without question, that's where we're going to see, those types of uses continuing in the future. The idea with creating a different zone that would accommodate campgrounds was we have heard, even during the coastal protection work, a lot of residents saying we want to have additional kind of public input when we're looking at campground developments. And so the zone, that separate zone, and as we noted, we'll mention it later, but it's called commercial recreation. And that's just geared towards, it's not to say you couldn't do a campground there. It's just saying it needs to have a closer look when somebody wants to do a campground, and that there's an ability for the public to have a say and to have some control over what it looks like in the end. So there's a few of those types of uses that with this plan, we've kind of categorized them in a way that they're certainly permitted, but it's a special zone, so you need to go through a process.
Councillor Hubley.
Thank you. Basically the same question. I see that it permits commercial and industrial, but specifically the home-based business. So is that a different zoning, or is it just permitted?
It would be just permitted. So home-based businesses are not regulated in that zone.
Councillor, or Deputy Mayor Vino.
Thank you. I should have asked this question at the beginning, because every time we go through a slide, it's my first thought. And that is, with what we have to do for zoning, does it include all of these different hamlets and rural and zones? Do we need to have everything? And I ask that because I'm apprehensive if we have too many zones, it'll quickly become confusing not only for developers, residents, but it's harder to manage. So if you could just kind of address that, that concept for me, that would help. Looking at what's in front of us now, it's not so complicated. We have rural and then our zoning around the lake. But the slide back with the hamlet center zones, I'm finding it hard to understand. And, I think when we consider our zoning framework, we need to make sure it's clear, it's easy to manage. And with what was presented in the hamlet zones, I'm worried that level of detail might actually make it more challenging as opposed to providing solutions for land use planning. So if you could just address how many we actually need to have, it would help me move forward with this process.
We don't have that much clarity or guidance from the province, so all of these things need to be considered. So you need to have something to deal with a commercial. You need to have something to deal with industrial. You need to have something to do with residential. It doesn't say you have to have a light industrial and a heavy industrial. It doesn't say you need to have a hamlet zone. And I think the hamlets and their definition and their boundaries and things, I think, is probably the most in our view need for closer look, and what should we do? What does the community want? Like, I think that of all the things here, that's one of the ones that we agree that it doesn't. We need to look a lot more at what would the value be, and how many of these communities should have that, like all of that piece around the hamlets. 100% agree. But generally with the amount of zones, it's a balance that you could have you could have a rural zone everywhere, with tons of uses permitted. But the challenge that you do run into, and I think we've experienced with lack of zoning, is different development proposals that come forward, lack of community input and oversight. You have communities saying, like, I can't believe this is happening. I want to have some way of having some say over this and some control. And then you have communities saying, we want flexibility, but we also want it to fit our context. And some people live in subdivisions, some people live in rural areas, some people live in hamlets or villages. So it's that without adding some level of complexity, we're not tailoring it enough. I mean, I think Tancook's a great example. When we were there, people saying, we want something that works for us. And that's probably not going to be what's going to work on the mainland. And I think that's a really valid point. But when we tailor something, that means you're adding that complexity, and it's a balance. But I would say in some ways that complexity does make it easier to manage, because the rules are more tailored to fit those areas. And so I think we may run into less friction when people feel like they've got the right rules in place for their community, and there isn't that kind of pressure or friction, when we have these different developments coming forward and people kind of saying, well, like, I want to have more say or whatnot. So I don't know if that totally answers your question.
I appreciate you saying that, and I 100% agree, especially with the Tancook component. It's very different out there. I just want to make sure that those that might be listening or in the audience know that you're basically presenting, this is what it could look like. We're not deciding on this today. We're not deciding on this tomorrow. You're giving us the options of what is out there, and we can take that back. And as we move through the process, we might make zones more broader as opposed to less number. So I just want to make sure that's out there for the public, that this is not what's happening. Your job is to provide us with the information, and then we can go back and fine tune it from there. So thank you.
Yeah, I think Deputy Mayor Vino raises an important point, because I think when I looked at this and the initial document, I went, there's a lot of zones. Do we need all these? And we had a question this morning from one of our residents, Councillor Hubley had, regarding the number of zones. And what you're doing is putting out a plate full of options. Our work will be around deciding what, with your advice, what steps we want to take to implement those. So yes, it's on the books that there are 18 zones or whatever the number is, but are those the ones we're going to actually put in place? And that'll be for us to decide. And over time, those options will be in part of our strategy that could be brought forward, as I understand, because planning goes on forever. This is one of the steps along the way. So we're going to go to Councillor Moore and then Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chastity, for bringing that up, because I know probably with the YouTube live stream and all that today, people are going to get the idea that we're going to put a hamlet center in New Germany, and that's the last thing I need to go in New Germany, to go to the store today and have that shoved in my face. So I thank you for clarifying that. And all these things that you're presenting to us today were just a presentation, like Chastity said. We're not making no decisions. These all go to the public again. The public gets to have their say again. So thank you for clarification of that.
Councillor Smith.
Just along these lines of ease of use for the public. I think I've brought this up before. I think in terms of the plan being easy to read and digest, that there needs to be some thought into the next draft and how the zones are presented, because I think what people are most interested in is not reading all the regulations for every area. They want to look at a map, see what their zone is and what are their permitted uses. And I've seen other plans that have, tables making that super, super clear. And I think if we could clear away some of the some of the details for people, that it would go a long way in helping people feel comfortable with the kind of planning we're doing. The other question I have is, if we don't create a zone under a land use designation or whatever, what would be the process for creating zones later? Like, is it better to have more zones that maybe we're not using now, rather than having to create them later? You know what I mean? Like having the definitions now rather than realizing that we missed some unique thing or area and having to come back to it.
I guess part of the answer is that you need to be able to allow all the different types of uses that exist. So we want to be as comprehensive as we can by identifying what are those types of uses, and then you can't not allow them. So part of what the MGA says is, unless there's a real, like, if it's a flood risk area or if it's an erosion risk, like those types of things, yeah, you can prohibit most types of things. But if you have, a heavy industrial type of use and you've defined it, but you've never allowed it anywhere, that's a problem. Like, you have to be accommodating to different types of uses. So if you've got a type of use that, yes, we recognize it exists, yes, we want to, have it in there because we know someday somebody's going to come up with this type of thing. The question then becomes, well, where are you going to allow it and how are you going to allow it? So as an example, with the campgrounds approach, there's a lot of different ways you could go about that. You could say, we don't need to have a commercial recreation zone. We could say campgrounds are permitted as of right in the rural zone. So anybody could be 200 site, whatever, campground, it's permitted as of right in that zone. You just come and get your permit and you're good to go. You could take kind of a middle ground approach where you say, it's permitted, but you need to go through site plan approval, and we're going to look a little bit more closely. It's still permitted though, because we've established that it is permitted in that rural zone. It's just we might look at something like stormwater, or we might have some buffering requirements around the edge. But regardless of the property, if it's zone rural, you can do a campground there. What's the advantage of having this approach with this zone would to say, there may be some properties that aren't suitable for that use. And there's an opportunity for the public and council to say whether or not whatever property it is even suitable for that use, and say yes or no. And in cases where you say no, you have the ability to do that, as opposed to if it were kind of that lesser control where you wouldn't be able to say no. You could just say, we can have a say in what it might look like. So that's an example of the situations where you do have to accommodate and think of those. And, there's some cases where, yeah, the use, or having that zone may or may not be as beneficial, but having zones does give you the opportunity to have a more clear say on whether a property is appropriate for that use at all going forward, and then thinking of the uses that fit within that zone. The commercial recreation zone, that's probably speaking to more common types of uses that we see in rural areas. So the other types of things in that, I think, are like things like shooting ranges. They're probably like the more impactful, but there's a recreation component. But by having that kind of zone, you may have properties there and they're just not appropriate for that use at all, and you have the ability to control that.
What I'd like us to do is, if we could finish the discussion around the rural designation, we'll leave Lakeshore, we're going to take a break, and then come back, because I think there'll be lots of questions around Lakeshore, so.
Okay, so the next piece here will be the rural agriculture and rural residential. So if we can go through those probably right now. Okay, perfect. My slides will catch up to me here. There we go. We already talked about this, so I don't think anyone will be surprised by this. I think you'll probably recall the discussion around this, but There's a zone that is called rural agriculture potential, which is based on soil class. And that's kind of looking at lands that have at least 60% class 3 soil and are larger than 4 hectares or 10 acres, and are not in like a settlement area, like a hamlet, or they're not in the watershed protection. So it's kind of, you cut all those things out, and then you're left with these areas. And so there's kind of a mapping analysis that was done to identify where these properties are, and they're clustered, and many of them are logical areas where you'd see a lot of farms, and there's others where there isn't a lot of kind of current farming, but the soil exists. And then there are other areas where there are farms, but the soil class doesn't match this. So it's not a perfect kind of approach or science to protecting all agricultural uses. It's more focused on protecting the soil so that it could be farmed in the future. And in terms of how it compares to that other rural general zone, exactly the same uses permitted. The only difference here is that in the policy document, the municipal planning strategy, there's some policies that say you can't do large-scale residential development in these areas. So that's where that protection is coming from. So limiting new roads, new flag lots, a limit to the amount of new residential lots to say you can do some, but you can't do 20, 30 lot subdivision type of thing. Now the rationale for that is because the type of development that we see in the rural areas is largely residential. And that is the type of development that is being built on areas that have good agricultural soils. In terms of what we've heard from the public on this, we have had a lot of discussion about agricultural generally in this process. The agricultural lands, there's quite a lot of feedback where people are saying we want to protect the agricultural land. So this is one of the ways you can do that. It's not the only way. People have brought forward some concerns that say, well, I see that, but there's other farms that are out there that we want to protect those lands. They're not shown here. How do we do that? Some of that is probably because we cut off the parcel size at 10 acres, and we talked to a lot of farmers and landowners that they're farming on a lot smaller properties. They're just a couple acres, but they combine, they have various parcels that they've kind of used together to kind of compile their operation. And we did also hear from a few farmers that were concerned about the limits on subdivisions because they were thinking more about the future and how would they retire, or was there anyone they could pass the farm on to. Generally, people, they don't want to make the lives of farmers any more difficult because they already have an uphill battle. So people are cautious about limits on anything that farmers could do in the future, but still kind of wanting to say, how can we best protect agricultural land? So that's some of the feedback.
There is a question,
heard about
Reed.
that.
Councillor Moore.
Thank you. I think I asked this before. This is so overwhelming that if, let's say you're in a kind of a rural residential, you're in an area that has residential and commercial, and then you have like some very prominent farmland that abuts all those properties. And right now it's being farmed. But in 20 years' time, if it's deemed R2, are we saying that in 20 years' time, if somebody, because it's next to a development area, that we're saying that the people that own it cannot sell it to make residential? Is that what we're saying?
Under this approach, what it would say is they can sell it to whoever they want.
Right,
They can build the same thing you could build on a regular rural property.
right.
But if they wanted to subdivide it and put a road in and create a bunch of lots, that's when they'd be limited. Yeah, so it would limit their ability to subdivide and do a traditional kind of subdivision. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if this is if this is a good fit for down the road, because right now, yes, I'm all for protecting farmland. I'm not that I don't want to protect it, but I'm looking into the future when I'm not here, when a lot of us aren't going to be here, and not here, but here, and we're putting in place things that we are tying people's hands in the future. And then another council's going to have to come in and rip this all apart so that someone can expand their growth area around what's already kind of a rural urban. I think we're being too stringent. I think that what we need here is just something that's one blanket all over the municipality. I know we have commercial places, we have Osprey Village, we have places that, but if we could just have one blanket zone or two, but having all these different ones is very confusing. Thank you.
Councillor Hubley.
A little bit of a concern here. Hemford Forest is already planned.
Yeah.
How would this affect their planning? Because I haven't read it word for word, but I don't think that this was considered in their plan.
Yeah,
So would
this wouldn't
stricter
interrupt
would apply?
their, no, it wouldn't, yeah, the intention not here is not to change anything that's in that existing plan area. Yeah.
Would it be stricter would apply?
In the case of those specific policies that I mentioned, so if there's a wetland or if there's a water course that's there, the way that this first draft is written, I can't recall off the top of my head what the current Hemford Forest
No, me
restrictions
either.
are that are there. But if let's say it had a 20-meter water course setback, and what's in this plan says 30, then the 30 would apply because the way that it's written.
Water course. And
Correct, yeah. But that's the only pieces that this larger plan would kind of override those existing secondary plans. Everything else in those plans would be intended to stay as is.
Interesting, where we're saying it's R2. I'd have to read the Hemford Forest planning before I could comment more.
Okay, let's move on the rural piece and finish that up. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Deputy Mayor Vino.
Sorry, I'm all alone over in the corner over here. Can you go back 2 slides, just quickly? So it's not surprising, I actually heard quite a lot about this. If you look where Town of Lunenburg is, and District 10 being the communities that surround that, there would be a lot that falls under the R2 zone. And there is a lot of land, and I've heard that in a lot of cases, generations have traditionally passed this land down, but they don't have children or grandchildren that want to pursue a farming industry. So limiting what they could do if they choose to sell, which might be what they need to do, financially, security, whatever it might be. I've also heard things from people saying that the province should step in and buy the land if I'm not allowed to develop it. And while that's a whole different category, I'm worried about this one by telling people they can't change what they want to do on their land if they have no willingness or want to farm it. It's a big question mark for me.
Some of these policies, this one in particular, really is one of those questions of greater public good, I guess, in that there are certain limitations that could be applied to individuals with the objective of long-term public good that this council is going to have to consider. I will note that the protection of agricultural lands is a statement of provincial interest, so it can't be ignored entirely. There are lesser protections that you could apply. Don't get me wrong, there's other plans out there that have been approved by the province that, you know, kind of, I would say they kind of work around the edges, I guess, to put in place something that says we're protecting lands. The challenge is that, you know, we have the data to look back at where has the most development occurred, where has the most, where are the agricultural lands that exist, and the easiest lands to develop on, as we are here today in Cookville, are agricultural lands, because the soil's easy to dig, it's usually flat, You can put in a septic system, you can put in a basement, all of those things make it easy to develop. Traditionally, our communities have been developed around those communities because that was their source of food. And so they needed to build somewhere where they could produce that food for the people that live there. So there's no question it's a very tricky thing to do, because you really are, whatever you do, you're going to put some limits on individuals but for the kind of common good, and that's definitely a challenge.
Councillor Smith.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise the point too that I in agreement with Deputy Mayor Vino. I think this is going to become a more contentious issue as people look at the maps. I think it's good to recognize that in the first round of consultations, a lot of people were not identifying what zone they were in. They were looking at the plan as a whole. So I think in the next round, it's going to be really important for people to be able to look at the maps, see what area is proposed, because a lot of people would, like, a lot of this rural, this R2 zone does not make sense. So people will assume that certain farming areas are protected because they're farms, and not realize that actually the R2 is somewhere else on a place that isn't being farmed and maybe forested or just doesn't make sense. So, yeah, I look forward to the next round when we're all like zeroing in a bit more on what this means.
Okay, let's finish this piece up.
Okay, so the final piece here that falls under the rural designation would be rural residential. So the idea behind this zone is that you're protecting those residential neighborhoods that exist in our rural areas. So you're looking at residential developments. Do they have suitable amounts of groundwater? The neighboring properties, are they negatively impacted by new development? The zone was kind of applied to compact neighborhoods where you had residential uses that are the predominant use that don't include hamlets or lakeshore areas. So our staff kind of looked at areas that had been clearly kind of developed at once. So when we think of what a typical subdivision is, we're looking at more than just a couple of lots. It's typically where there was a new road constructed, whether that was private or public, to build several kind of residential lots around. And so that zone would be kind of primarily focused on permitting low-density residential development, some institutional, and things like home-based businesses. So when we talked about home-based businesses the last time council had a discussion like this, I think there was some discussion about, well, do we need to have those provisions in the bylaw at all? And so what those home-based business provisions do are, in an area like this, they allow additional flexibility. So basically you're saying this is primarily a residential area, but if you do want to have a business, this is what you could have it, but it's within these parameters. That's the way that those provisions would work. If you didn't have any of these kind of more limited residential zones, you wouldn't need to have those home-based business provisions at all, because you would just say there's no real limit to the businesses. But those are geared towards residential areas, allowing some flexibility in rural residential zones like this. The other important piece of this is that looking at future residential developments that had 6 or more lots, so it's using that same threshold as the cluster development regulations, but this time looking at individual lot creation, there's a policy in the municipal planning strategy that would say if someone's looking at more than 6 lots with an internal road, they would need to rezone to this zone first. And at that time, there's that opportunity for public input, as well as looking at things like groundwater supply. Is there enough groundwater to support this level of development? And if those pieces check out, you get that zoning in place, and then you can move forward with that subdivision application. So it's kind of trying to be consistent with the approach for cluster development, and also allowing that level of protection for those kind of very residential areas. In terms of what we've heard so far, there's been some mixed feedback on the level of control that people want for these areas, though most people do see that kind of that they recognize that they would like to see some type of higher level of control than the rural general. We did get some feedback that people were concerned about how much groundwater was available for, new development. And of course, the scale of development matters. So, people are thinking, how much development can you support with the amount of groundwater that's there? Having a zone and having that requirement to rezone, if you're doing a larger scale residential development, gives you that ability to make sure that there is adequate water. To show some examples of where those pockets would be, so Pine Grove is a close example. In the yellow there is showing us the rural residential. The kind of brown would be that rural agriculture potential. The green is Parks and Rec. And then we've got the rural general, which is kind of the beige. Over in the Parkdale Franny Corner area, we have that Lakeshore zone, which we'll get into the discussion afterwards. But there's also some pockets there of rural residential because they don't have water frontage. And so you've got some kind of more clustered developments there without water frontage, and would kind of fall into this type of category. So that's the approach behind rural residential.
I'm not sure we're talked out, but maybe we need a little break, and we'll take 10 minutes and then come back to start in on the Lakeshore. Thank you for now. We'll come back. Okay, we'll resume our discussion, council, and move to a discussion around Lakeshore residential zone is the next one.
Great, thank you, everyone. Just one quick clarification. I'm going to jump backwards just to show you the Hemford Forest. We made a bit of an error with the label there. It just should say Hemford Forest plan area is just south. We're not even seeing it on the slide, so I just wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page. Yep, so that's our mistake. Should just say Hemford.
That was my concern. Thank
Yep,
you.
you're welcome.
Okay, so the Lakeshore residential zone, this zone is basically intended to protect the health of lakes. The municipality has many, many lakes, and their health is very important. So this zone is about enabling low-density residential development. It's applied to surrounding lakes, so the lands that are surrounding lakes. So when we did this zoning exercise, we made sure that all of the lands needed to have some amount of waterfront. So if it was, for example, a lot across a road or something, it was still maybe in the vicinity of a lake, but it did not have water frontage, it was not included in this zone. So I just want to drive that point home, that all lands included in this zone have waterfront. So the idea was that this zone is applied to lakes that are experiencing development pressures or have the potential to have development potential, or are located near transportation routes or populated areas. So with this zone, there's a minimum lot frontage requirement of 50 meters, and then there's a larger lot size requirement compared to the other zones. And then within this zone, there's a limited range of permitted uses to protect water quality. So one to emphasize is the maximum amount of dwelling units is 2, and a maximum 3 tourist accommodation units. And then things that are in relation to lake activities like marine-related uses or marinas would be permitted. Some institutional uses and some agricultural uses such as background agriculture would be permitted. But a lot of industrial type uses would not be permitted in this zone, and many other commercial uses as well.
Just a question from Councillor Moore.
Thank you. So I understand this is just a draft. It's not written in stone. It's going to be changed over the next how many years? I keep saying that. So if someone has been, if they have a piece of land on a lake right now, and they're waiting till they retire, and they want to sell their main home and build a cabin on their piece of land, say it's Sherbrooke Lake. If they don't have 50 meters of frontage, we will not give them a building permit? Is that what we're saying?
That would be for new lots. So if you were going to subdivide a vacant or a large parcel of land, that new lot would need to have lot frontage of 50 meters. But if the lot's existing, then that would be fine.
But aren't we tying the hands in the future of I just feel, and I understand, I mean, you guys are doing your job, and you're bringing it to us, and we get to pick it apart, and you know how I feel about all of this, but I know we have to do something. But I feel as though so much of this is tying the hands in the future of people. Because, yes, people may have 50, they may have a lot now that they want to, that they're not going to develop, and they want to, after this is all passed, they may want to subdivide it and give a lot to each child. But we're not going to be able to give building permits because they don't have 50. Like, I find this very, very wrong, if that's a good word. Thank you.
Councillor Oikel.
On the other hand, I'm really glad that that property that's there now, regardless as to its size, will be allowed to put a building on it. Because unlike what we did with the coastal, we didn't do that. right? If you had a small lot, too small, 30 meters, you couldn't build anything on it. So I'm really glad to see that you're making that suggestion, because I think that would relieve a lot of people, because some people do have tiny lots and they just want to put, you know, a little something there, right? So I'm really glad to see, at least to see that. Thank you.
Councillor Hubley.
Just clarification question. Frontage, when you say lot frontage, you are speaking the distance from the house or the building to the water, correct? No. You're speaking of how much lake frontage that person owns. Okay. What's the setback right now? Do you know right off the top of your head? For the
So-
building to the water?
So we don't have any setbacks.
Okay, I thought we did.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But one point I just want to clarify is that this zone wouldn't have a special, well, as proposed, it wouldn't have a special setback, water course setback, but the inland water body setback would apply to all lakes and rivers and streams and so on. So a significant water course would still have a setback, and that was proposed in the document as 30 meters. So it wouldn't be specific to this zone, but a water course setback would still apply.
I just want to speak out on this, that 50 meters is a lot. I live on a lake. 50 meters is a lot, and you would stop me from building on my property because I didn't own 50 meters on the water. My point of living on the water would just be to get my boat in or to be able to swim. I don't need to own everything to be able to build. I'm going to want that reconsidered.
Just to clarify, so we're talking about 50 meters being the width of your lot. So, yeah, for if somebody's creating a new lot, that's when this requirement would come into play. So if somebody has 10 meters of water frontage today, then there's nothing stopping them from building. It's only about when you're creating new lots that this 50-meter lot width piece would come into effect. And the intention of that is to reduce the overall number of lots on a lake, because the number of lots, you can squeeze a lot more lots if you do very narrow lots, and there's increased kind of development pressures that occur on a lake in terms of the water quality. So that's the intention behind having a larger lot width or frontage requirement. But it's only about new lots going forward, correct?
Councillor Smith.
Just as far as, like, I have a few questions about Lakeshore residential, because I do have a lot of areas in my district that this would apply to. And one of the issues I see is that, and that I'm trying to figure out how this would be applied, is that you've got areas where, or subdivisions or roads where you've got communities that are zoned different depending on what side of the road they're on. So on one side of the road, if you're on the lake, you could have fewer dwellings than on the other side of the road. Am I correct?
Yeah, in some areas that's correct, yeah.
Okay, I think that's gonna have to be super clear when we're going out as well, like, for communities. Yeah, I just wonder how much sense that makes for the defining communities and what they look like.
I just want to add to that. So there's, maybe Reed, if you go back a couple slides to that. Yeah, that slide. The next map there. So the Parkdale map on your right. So you can see the green Lakeshore residential zone and then a bit of the yellow, which is the rural residential zone. So that's an example of an area where we zoned the waterfront properties Lakeshore residential, and then if there was a road or sort of like an established lakeshore community, The other portion of that community was zoned rural residential, which typically have very similar regulations or kind of like a stringency in terms of zoning for the rural residential and the lakeshore residential. So it is acknowledging that there is a community there and similar regulations would apply. Not so much about the units, like the max of 2 units on a lot, that would just be for the lakeshore residential zone. But in terms of other types of permitted uses, that would be more consistent, just to clarify that.
Yeah, and maybe I can have further conversations with you about like what specific communities would look like that have those combined zones in them. Can I ask another lakeshore residential? I know that, we hear a lot about people not wanting too many regulations on their land. But I will say that one of the issues I've heard about is access to the shoreline for fishing. And the setback in terms of the vegetative buffer that's in the plan, and you say it's not just for lakeshore residential, but around all inland lakes. The gentleman who brought it forward to me just wanted to make sure that we were aware that the Angling Act allows people to access the shoreline if that shoreline is undisturbed or uncultivated. So I just want to make sure that when we're moving forward with the plan, that we're keeping this in mind, because people have lost a lot of access to lakes, and in terms of fishing, they don't want to see it further cut off. So those vegetative buffers, I know some people are looking at them and thinking, well, that will maintain actually my access to that lake for fishing in the future. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That wasn't something that we're kind of really paying attention to, but we'll look into kind of what the Angling Act has, and we'll see how that could affect things along lake shores. Absolutely. I just in terms of kind of what the thinking behind this zone is, I guess the overall consideration here is that kind of best planning practice is that there's traditionally been a lot of development pressure on our lakes because they're beautiful places to be. But there is a risk of so much development occurring on them that the water quality degrades. And so you kind of, and it affects the people who live on them ultimately as well. But there's the challenges that you run into are things like runoff. So runoff is a big one. So people have shorelines that are a lot of hard surfaces. There's things like fertilizer, things like older septic systems that are leaking. Those nutrients, things like that, will run into the lake and kind of cause things like algae blooms, and run into all the other kinds of kind of environmental issues. So the bigger objective behind whether it's this zone or the setback requirements that are contained in the other section of this plan are to create some sort of a balance of allowing low kind of level density residential development continuing to occur on lakes and other watercourses, but with certain restrictions in mind that are the overall objective is environmental considerations, because there's lots of evidence about improved water quality with better setbacks from the water. So if you move development back from the water enough, you allow things like vegetative buffers, and you allow people to have a lawn around their home and enjoy it, but also not have that affect the water as much. And then also have the issue with the amount of number of homes and the number of people using a particular lake or whatnot, creating that pressure as well. So that's the thinking behind larger lot widths. That's requiring people to have, not as many total lots potential that you could do around a lake. And then you're also giving people a little bit more flexibility in those lots to have a water access area that they can get down and have the dock and all that, but then also have a portion of that lawn that can have a vegetative buffer as well, and allow people not to have to do everything that they want to do with the lake in a smaller area. So that's the overall thinking behind both this zone and the other kind of regulations about watercourses.
Deputy Mayor Vino.
Thank you. Councillor Hubley asked for a clarification question earlier on the 50-meter width. And I understand that if somebody had a large piece of property, wanted to sell their lakefront lots, this, which was presented before us, would say you need to have 50 meters. If I was a resident looking into this, I'd also want to know the watercourse setbacks. And I'm curious why that's separate and not included in the Lakeshore residential zone. To me, that's where I would look for it. I'm not saying we should have it, I'm just saying this is where I would look for it. So why is that separate from the list on the previous slide?
So the watercourse setback, it's a general provision because it applies to all watercourses. So, yeah, so it's not zone specific, it's just a general provision, if that helps to clarify that.
Just to further Anna's point, there are lakes that don't have this zone on them. And we also have things like Lahave, smaller rivers, other streams and anything from large to small that wouldn't have this zone. And so it's a level of protection that would be applied to these areas, but also places like the Lahave or places like those lakes that may not have the Lakeshore zone applied to them, just to be consistent.
Councillor Smith.
On the setback, the 30 meters, I'm sure that you followed what happened in Halifax. One thing that is on my mind as we go through this process is that we take this plan to the community, there's consultation, we decide on something, we put it in our plan, and then the province rejects it because they feel it restricts development or that kind of thing. Can you comment at all on like what happened in HRM and do we foresee any of these? Maybe a better question is, has the 30-meter setback been implemented in other rural municipalities and been accepted by the province?
The best case we're thinking of is Cumberland. I believe they have a 30-meter setback that also applies to wetlands as well. Now, there's the coastal protection regulations introduced a 30-meter setback for wetlands, and that was approved by the province just last year or the year before. So there's a good track record here. I think I don't know anything more than what's been in the news in terms of what occurred in HRM. What I would say is that the province, through the approvals process, the folks our counterparts who work at municipal affairs do provide the opportunity to send us or have us send them our draft document, and they can give us some feedback on it before we officially send them the final version that council has adopted. So that gives us an opportunity. They can flag issues if they see, the minister or other levels of government or other departments have a particular problem with something that has been put in draft form here. They can flag it and we can deal with it before we get to that final stage and we think everything's all sorted out. I don't think that may have been what occurred in Halifax and they still ran into that issue. I don't know, but it does give us at least a better sense of hopefully on their end, they can flag stuff for us without getting too far down that path.
Councillor Oikle.
Just as with coastal protection, you brought us back the number of people who would be affected. And I know that we're doing zones rather than the policy on on the 30 meters. But when we do get to that point, if you could have those numbers as to how many residents would be affected by not being able to build because of the 30 meters, if you could, just as a note for the future. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point. We can absolutely do some of that analysis. And one thing that is not in this plan, but there's an it's an option to do it. So Queens has some abilities under their regulations that if people are in a situation where that 30-meter setback can't be met and the lot size is too small, there's still the ability to build. So there is the ability to have something like that here, to say, okay, well, everyone needs to meet the 30 meters if they can. But if you can't, because your lot itself is only 30 meters deep, that would, there is an ability to give those people some flexibility to still build as well. So just to raise that is something we can discuss more in November, I guess, when council needs to give us some direction. And that's one of those things where you could say, I don't want to go with this, but I don't want to get rid of it entirely. Let's create more flexibility. That's an option there too.
Councillor Moore.
Yeah, that was my question also. Some people then in the future might have 50 meters of frontage, but they don't have 50 meters back. And that's a problem with me. That was going to tell them that, there's no flexibility, because I think like I said before, the very first word in this document should be flexibility. Another question is, what if it was right now on a lake, you could put an RV, set it up seasonal, leave it there all year, attend it seasonal, put a privy or something there. With these regulations that might be coming down the pipe the way they are now or changed, what does that mean for those RV people that want to, I know if they're already there, they're grandfathered, okay. But what about down in the future if somebody had, let's just say they had a 30-foot frontage. It was subdivided, it's 30 feet frontage, and they have an RV that they want to put on this lot. Like, are we telling them that they can't?
I'm just making sure
Yeah.
to give you the right information.
Yeah.
So there's a section here that's general provisions where there's some qualifications about recreational vehicles. So speaking to that kind of example that you've outlined, like the pit privy or other septic system is kind of included as a requirement. So if you wanted to do that type of thing, you bring it in for the season or whatever, that's fine, as long as you've got some type of approved septic system. Pit privy is an approved system under environment, or it could be a fully functioning. The other component was it would need to meet the other setback requirements that any other. So if you had to have your cottage set back 30 meters, your RV's got to be set back 30 meters too. So it tries to place similar level of requirement for those types of situations that would apply to the cottage and apply them to the RV. That doesn't apply in, you're going for the weekend and you're just parking there and you've got some family getting together for a reunion or something, and then you're gone after the long weekend. Like, this is kind of people who are seasonally have a site, and they're going to park it there all season kind of thing.
If I may. So if a lot of these RVs are set up as permanent dwellings also, because that's what people can afford. So if they do not have a 30-foot setback, there is flexibility there. If they meet the requirements of on-site privy, water and all that, well water and all that kind of stuff, we would probably be able to do flexibility and allowing them to do that, correct?
I'm not sure exactly what flexibility, maybe if you could just clarify the flexibility piece.
Okay, so someone has a lot right now, we can't tell them that they can't do something, right? Okay, so, but after this planning all comes into a place and whatever Lakeshore residential zone that we decide, you know, the meters and all that kind of stuff, if they don't have a 30-foot setback, they want to put an RV there, even if it, okay, so if they want to put an RV there, they're going to leave there all year, they're going to have a privy and a water system, but they're only going to be seasonal. But what if that becomes their permanent home? What then?
Under the way this is written, it wouldn't matter.
Okay.
So this, the way that this draft is written, it says you can live in an RV if that's what you need to do.
Right.
The only requirements being you meet the same setbacks as everyone else for what their building would have, and you have to have some type of septic system.
Okay.
But if you live in it for a weekend or you live in it all year,
Right.
there's nothing saying you can't do that.
Uh-huh.
And we did hear a lot of feedback that said they support that. They want to make sure people can live in RVs because, that wasn't every single person,
Uh-huh.
but there was a lot of people who spoke in favor of that because of the housing situation people
Right,
are in.
exactly. Okay,
Yeah.
thank
So
you.
yeah, it would be treated the same as a dwelling, basically. Yeah.
Okay, let's keep moving.
Okay, so moving on to the conservation designation, there's one zone under this designation, which is the conservation zone. So this designation is intended to protect and preserve critical habitats and ecologically significant areas. It's applied to lands that have important conservation values, such as beaches and designated protected areas, and to protect drinking water and preserve natural habitats. So the conservation zone is intended to safeguard the ecological integrity of lands entrusted, donated, or designated for environmental conservation. There's a very limited amount of permitted uses that are allowed in this zone, and these include low-impact recreational uses, education and research related to land use conservation. The zone is applied to existing federally, provincially, or municipally protected lands and all public and privately owned lands recognized under the Beaches Act.
Councillor Oikle.
So would this also apply to the common land down in Garden Lots area? Or is that separate?
No, I don't believe that it was applied to that specific property because that's a less kind of clear, I think, I'm not sure if that really meets this zone. This is intended really for those situations where it's like a nature trust or conservation group that their mandate is just protection and they kind of align with what the permitted uses are here. Now, if there was a group like that, and I know there's some other examples like that, we've gone through and looked at the obvious examples, but we want to hear if there are other people who want to see that put in place, if that aligns with what they want to do. But I don't believe that that's exactly kind of fits this intention here. I will say, though, we did want to flag that there is a key component of that piece that's privately owned lands recognized under the Beaches Act would have implications for people in the Kingsburg area. There's been a lot of discussion over the years about that particular situation. There are homes and lots in that area. This would make it very difficult to do anything further than what's there today. So there's a conversation needed about that particular area. That's the only one that we're aware of where it's really kind of privately owned lands that would, what the approach here would be to place this zone on those privately owned lands. Everything else falls under this is, already a provincial protected or municipal protected thing. But that is a specific situation where there needs to be a lot more engagement about the implications.
So on this, the diagram, I think it's in your next slide, probably. The area, the Colpton area, those are protected under Nature Trust, am I correct, or?
I think it's the Shingle Lake Nature Reserve.
Okay.
The one on the bottom left.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But there is also land, it might not be, yeah, there's also some land there that's Nature Trust protected.
Just to clarify, like, who sets the uses on these lands? Is it according to the legislation, provincial, federal, municipal? Because I would think that each would have different uses attached to it. I'm
Yeah, like,
a little
They
unclear
each would
on-
have their own kind of guidelines about what you can and can't do. This zoning, to be honest, in terms of federal and provincial lands, wouldn't have really much force, you know, and in terms of, at the end of the day, if somebody was, if the we know if a province owns some land, they may wish to do something other than what the zone says. It's trying to signify that the intention is to keep it as a conservation area. And so, but if push came to shove and one of those upper levels of government wanted to do something different, then they could. When it comes to those kind of, maybe it's owned by an organization like a Nature Trust, that does give that additional layer of protection to outline what those permitted uses are. But all those different organizations and levels of government would have their own kind of mandate or policies about what they could or couldn't do. We did, reach out, we'd had some specific stakeholder discussions with some of the folks working in the kind of land protection sector. And we will, in future engagements as well, specifically be reaching out to the ones, especially where we know that we're proposing, if there's a conservation zone on them, to ensure that that's something that they want. And so far what we've heard is people that is what they want, because their mandate is protection. So if it's different NGOs that have an objective of protecting land, then this is helping them achieve that as well. So generally it's all in alignment, but there is that ability for other levels of government to kind of go astray, I guess. So the next few slides are back to the protected watershed designation, and we've spoken a fair amount about this, and the previous council as well had several discussions about this, but just as a refresher, we're talking here about the drinking water supply for Bridgewater, Lunenburg, Mahone Bay, as well as parts of MODL, including this area. So the idea here is to provide protection to the drinking water supply through land use controls. So the approach that's here is using kind of two zones as well as an overlay to provide protection to those water supplies by limiting the amount of development occurring in them. So the PW1 zone, protected watershed 1, is geared towards kind of the highest level of protection. It's very similar to the conservation zone in that it's aimed at really not allowing any new development except something that relates to water treatment or distribution, and would be kind of prohibiting any type of new development other than what's there today. So especially for those lakes that are smaller and have a smaller kind of watershed, that becomes more at risk, and so the importance of this is greater. So in this case, it would be kind of those immediate areas around Dares Lake and Oakland Lake that would kind of fall into this category, as well as the government-owned lands that are in the Hebmelipsigit and Minimkeek watershed areas. The next kind of tier is what's called a protected watershed 2 zone, and that's aimed at protecting the privately owned parcels, specifically in the hamlets and Memkeek areas around the town of Bridgewater. So that would be basically allowing very limited development to continue to occur there. So obviously we'd have the municipal water treatment and distribution, but also some low-density residential uses. To recognize there are privately owned lands in those areas. There is some level of development occurring. There are some lots that people may want to continue to build on. This would allow that to occur, but to a very limited degree, and also kind of not allowing a lot more in terms of no new roads, large lots, large frontages, significant setbacks beyond what we talked about that are kind of geared towards lakefront areas or water courses, above and beyond that, to recognize the kind of most of the cases where municipalities have water supply areas like this, they're fortunate to probably have like somewhere where it's surrounded by crown land. And in those cases, they don't allow any development around those lakes. That's not the case here, clearly. So again, it's trying to find a bit of a balance to allow some people to build, but as much protection as is possible. So that's the approach behind the protected watershed 2. And I'll just leave this on the slide up there so you can see kind of, we're not looking at the Dares Lake, we're looking at Mahone Bay's water source there, Oakland, and then the close to the Hebbville secondary plan area, we've got the water source for the town of Bridgewater there as well.
Councillor Wickle.
Yeah, so your 150 meters of water frontage, some of those lots that I was to while I was campaigning on the left-hand side there of the lake are on a hill, right? And so because, so is there any, to quote Councillor Moore, flexibility in that kind of regulation of 150, because they are, they're obviously not going to build closer, but but they're way up on a hill.
There's not currently built into the regulations as they're written now. That could be, that 150 could be adjusted as well. But as it's written now, it wouldn't be, if they can't meet that setback, they wouldn't be able to build. Yep.
Just because a lot of them are up on hills, right? And they couldn't build closer even if they wanted to the lake. So I think that it needs to be looked at on the individual basis, perhaps, especially around the lake shores.
Okay, and the last one, I think there was a discussion about this already in terms of the usefulness and the potential of this, but as it is now, the protected watershed overlay would recognize the kind of natural watershed boundary around these lakes and require livestock fencing to be set back a fair amount, 100 meters from water courses that would be in those areas. The idea being you're keeping those livestock away from streams and water courses that lead into the drinking water supply. It's not a significant measure, and this is only kind of applying to new situations. But I think there was a discussion previously around the table about, how often would this even apply and what types of situations. So I'll just put it on the slide here just to show like how it could be applied. It encompasses quite a bit of area beyond what the province kind of has established as those areas, and that's because when they were originally established, they didn't really have the technology to know where the watershed started and stopped, and they didn't include a fair amount of area around Laconia especially, and so those areas up there do in fact lead into these drinking water supplies. And so the intention there is to have a level, or recognize that and have some level of protection to recognize that there is actually a larger area that drains into the drinking water supply. So that's the thinking behind that overlay piece as well.
Councillor Hoopley.
With this watershed protection area in the Laconia area, I know that there are farmlands there. And currently the cattle graze the area and use that water for drinking. We're talking about grandfathering existing uses. Is that going to be one that's grandfathered? Where it
Yeah,
is
yeah,
a
this wouldn't
watershed?
apply to existing situations, yeah.
Okay.
I will just comment on that, though, that there are accepted practices, environmental farm plans associated with farms that would not be acceptable. So from an agricultural point of view, that may be happening, but there wouldn't be a restriction on it, but it would be not recommended from an environmental point of view in agricultural circles. I just say that because there's, yeah, anybody who's a registered farm who is accessing any government funding or programming, they would need an environmental farm plan to be in place, and that would put restrictions. This has been in place for many years. That would put restrictions around what the fencing requirement, and that's been a practice for many years. Now, not all farms are registered because they may only have a few cattle, but in farming circles, agricultural circles, the requirement for fencing on waterways has been a long accepted practice. Councillor Bell.
In the past, we have partnered with BayCap and actually built fences to keep cattle out of the examples is in the northern end. I won't name properties, but we were a participant helping make that happen.
Thank you for that. Councillor Reinhardt.
I might have missed this, but just for clarification, proposed setbacks for water courses, would those be the same in these watershed protection areas as any water course?
That's a good question. So it depends on the zone. So where we're talking about this overlay, in this case, this is only applying that livestock fencing requirement. There would be an underlying zone in these areas. So you can see we've got Lakeshore residential, rural. In those zones, you'd have that normal kind of 30-meter setback requirement applying. However, if I jump back into these protected watershed 1 and 2, I believe there's a, I'd have to double check, but it might be 50 or 70 meter water setback. So very significant that would apply to these zones. So these are kind of an exception going above and beyond that 30-meter kind of across the board that would apply to these specific zones. Yeah.
Moving along to the zones throughout the plan area. So we finished all the zones that are in a designation. So these zones here are permitted throughout all designations and are not necessarily put in a designation. So I'll just go over them now. So starting with the commercial recreation zone. So that zone was created after hearing initially a lot about campgrounds and people having issues with the placement of campgrounds and the effects that it has on neighborhoods and the environment. So like Reed mentioned before, this isn't the only way to deal with campgrounds. This is just a way, and we can work with that and we can change as needed. But basically this zone is intended to reduce land use conflicts with commercial recreational uses, such as campgrounds and RV parks, among other uses. It permits high-impact indoor and outdoor land uses and large-scale tourist accommodations. So campgrounds and RV parks would be permitted in this zone through site plan approval. So there's additional requirements as to how the site would be laid out, including buffer requirements and traffic flows and things like that. And then outdoor racetracks, shooting ranges would be permitted through a development agreement. So these are more rare uses, however, it would require rezoning and a development agreement, so a more stringent approach to make sure that these uses are properly cited. And with this zone, there's larger setback requirements. And then, as indicated on the previous, the big zone map, so this is one of the zones that hasn't been pre-zoned, so this would be sort of a placeholder zone for future use. So any future use that would fall under this sort of range of uses would require rezoning. So there's no map to go along with this zone because it hasn't been zoned at all. And then, so for the general commercial zone, again, this zone, like the other one, has not been zoned. So there's no map to go along with this one either. So the general commercial zone is intended to support a variety of commercial operations. It permits a wide range of land uses, commercial land uses, small-scale industrial uses, and some natural resource-related activities, and as well as accessory residential uses. So in that case, if there was a main use, which was a commercial use, and someone had, say, a store, and they wanted a residential use, that would be the secondary use. So that would be permitted on that lot. And then this zone would really only come into play if there was a certain use that wasn't permitted in a zone. So if there was a type of use that wasn't permitted, say in the rural general zone, like a drive-through restaurant or something like that, that's when that use could be rezoned into the general commercial zone. So it wouldn't come up very often, but it is there as sort of as a placeholder zone. And then the recreation and park zone, we have already zoned, or we had proposed zone or areas that were zoned this one. So this is intended to protect parklands and open spaces. It permits a range of recreational activities, institutional facilities, community gathering spaces, as well as commercial food services that might be part of a recreational use. So some commercial uses are permitted here, and it's only applied to existing provincial and municipal parks. So the maps here indicate the Mark and the Miller Point Peace Park in Dayspring. That was zoned in P, so the green there, as well as River Ridge Common in New Germany.
Okay, and this next zone is another one that there's been no lands pre-zoned. So this is, I think when we're talking about the example of Hebville and, looking at future growth opportunities, perhaps Dayspring, and the edges of, Bridgewater or other areas where we could see there's potential for new growth. This is intended for uses for particularly when you have a single site or a large site or a couple of properties that you could imagine there might be a large scale development proposed for those sites. The way that zone is structured is it's basically kind of used as a holding zone almost to say you can't just go ahead and build something here. It needs to be permitted. It's only permitted by development agreement. And then there's some criteria through the development agreement process that says you need to show us a whole master plan for this. And it needs to show us how you're doing stormwater and servicing and traffic and all of those things. So it's typically used for master planned communities when you're talking, hundreds or thousands of units. And it gives the opportunity for the municipality, the public to have a say in how a large kind of master planned site gets developed. And typically that's a process that's often kind of would be led by a developer, but they're kind of following this process because the zone has kind of indicated that this has to occur. And it's often kind of placed on those lands where you do anticipate some large-scale development happening, but you want to ensure that it's developed through a kind of process that looks at all of those different servicing and other aspects.
Deputy Mayor Vino.
How does this balance with our cluster development regulations? Would they kind of go parallel to each other for a developer approaching it?
It probably depends how they want to develop. I guess the cluster development regulations could, they would apply, but at the end of the day, both of them would be by development agreement. And so it's kind of the same process at the end of the day. This would essentially have probably more criteria that you're looking at because it's geared towards, large sites that probably have, new roads, things like that, whereas cluster development is a little bit more focused on, just residential developments that could only be 10 units in size. So this is probably just a bigger scale of that.
Just one final point. The cluster development land use bylaw doesn't apply if a development is serviced by sewer and water. So if this were happening close to town and taking advantage of the water and sewer availability, then there wouldn't be a conflict because the cluster development wouldn't apply.
Okay, so we're nearing the end. There's a light industrial zone, a heavy industrial zone, and then the fisheries and marine zone. So we're nearing the end. So for the light industrial zone, this zone's intended to accommodate low impact industrial uses. So in the land use bylaw, we sort of defined light industrial uses as a type of use that is not regularly obnoxious, just to clarify that. So with the heavy industrial uses, that is a type of use that is regularly obnoxious. So something that does create fumes or odor, noise, things like that. So this zone in particular, the light industrial zone, would be for industrial uses that do not regularly create land use conflicts. So it permits a range of light industrial uses and other non-hazardous or non-obnoxious uses, such as, there's lots of different types of uses, but things like automobile-related uses or self-storage facilities or heavy equipment sales and rentals, things like that. And then residential accessory uses would also be permitted in this zone. And then under the general provisions, which kind of fall with these industrial type uses, additional setbacks and vegetative buffers could apply. And then dealing with outdoor storage and parking and loading requirements and things like that, where if it was next to, say, a residential use or a school or a park or something like that, you might want to have more separation, intended separation between those uses. So that's what we figured would maybe work in those cases, to have either fencing or vegetative buffers. However, we have heard a little bit of backlash around that. So that's something to maybe consider going forward, to think about that kind of thing. And then with this zone, no lands were pre-zoned as well. So new uses would require a rezoning. And then for the heavy industrial zone, so this one's intended to accommodate high impact industrial uses, so uses that are regularly disruptive or potentially dangerous. And then residential uses are not permitted in this zone, or accessory residential uses, I should say. And then again, additional setbacks and vegetative buffers, those sorts of requirements would also apply when a use is adjacent to a residential, institutional, or park use. And then again, no lands were pre-zoned. And then the last one here is the fisheries and marine zone. So this zone is intended to support and accommodate fishing and marine related uses. It permits a range of fishing and marine related industrial uses like fish processing facilities, aquaculture operations, and then any commercial uses that are directly related to the fishing industry. Accessory residential uses are permitted. And then again, the setbacks and vegetative buffer and outdoor storage requirements could apply to these types of uses if it's next to a residential or similar use. And no zones were, no lands were pre-zoned, so there is no map. And that kind of, that's all the zones, I guess. That's it. So any.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for bearing with us. Yeah, that's a lot. This last slide here is just to kind of summarize what's coming next in this project. We sent out an email, newsletter, and things like that a couple of weeks ago when we kind of concluded the final pieces of our initial engagement. So the public engagement stuff did wrap up in June, but we did continue some stakeholder meetings with different groups from agricultural industry, development and real estate, environment, affordable housing. So we met with those throughout July as well. And all of that feedback, the public as well as stakeholders, is currently being compiled, and staff are currently focused on analyzing kind of the hundreds and hundreds of comments and different sources of feedback that we've gotten. And what that will kind of come together in a what we heard report that we'll be kind of bringing forward to council and the public in late October. So there's we have a kind of a timeline that we're working towards for that specific meeting the last week in October. But in terms of how that meeting should run and how whether it should be a special time or place or whatever that is, we haven't kind of defined that. And if there's specific suggestions around how, if council would like to create something that makes it more public facing in some way, you know, there's opportunities there for sure. Because it is real, it is trying to report back about what we heard from the public. And certainly we'll do lots of engagement with people online to make sure they know about it. But just in terms of how that meeting is run, like if there's ideas or suggestions around that, we're certainly open to whatever council would like to do for that meeting. The next piece after that is once we kind of deliver this report that says, here's what the public and stakeholders have said, then we will bring forward probably over a couple of different meetings, some kind of a couple of different reports that will bring issues forward in the form of seeking direction from council. So it will be stuff like, okay, Lakeshore zone, here's what the public said about it. Here's the kind of direction that maybe there's a specific planning, professional planning lens that we can provide some input on, but ultimately to say, okay, council, what would you like to see in that next draft? Give us a direction at that point, and then we will make those changes happen in that second draft. So we'll bring forward many of those different types of decision points, not to say that you have to commit to, you know, whatever that is for the final version, but it's to say we want to make sure that that second draft reflects what it is that council would like to see. We don't have all of the answers, but we will have that feedback from the public, and we will be able to say, this is maybe where we got a lot of feedback on this issue. Where would you like to take this? Here's an option for you, or here's a couple of options of what you could do, so that then we can take all of that feedback from you and then incorporate that and put it in a draft number 2. And that second draft, where we'll be coming back to you in March of next year. That's what we're working towards. And then we would kind of launch into another engagement process with the public kind of early spring of 2026, so next year, going back into the public and saying, okay, we heard a lot of feedback. Council has given us this direction on these certain specific topics, especially what's the feedback that you have on the second draft? Does it reflect what you wanted to see? Especially focused on really what those zones and having a lot more focus on the maps and really kind of getting that feedback that might be more detailed than the first version. So that's just an overview of kind of what's coming next. And yeah, and other than that, we're happy to take any questions as well.
Councillor Hubley.
I actually have a request, wondering if I can get a larger copy of the generalized future land use map. Even if it's just for District 4, I would love to see it for the whole municipality. But these are so small, I'm not sure if I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing.
Just for clarification, we can absolutely do that.
Thank you.
There's that, and then there's also the zoning map. The zoning map really contains those individual zones. Is that more what you're looking for, or do you want
No,
that,
I
or
think the zoning
designation?
map, or like Councillor Moore said, maybe both for my district, for District 4?
Yep.
If that would be
Yep,
possible?
for sure.
Can we all have that? Not just her, she's not going to.
Yeah, give me your glasses. Yeah.
We can print
Just
maps
so
for
I
everybody,
know
absolutely.
exactly
Yeah.
what I'm looking
Yeah.
at, and I'm not saying, oh, is this road or that road, just something like that.
Yep, thank you.
Councillor Smith.
Yeah, could we have also this slide? Could you send a copy of this slide to us? It wasn't in our package.
This last slide here,
Yeah,
yes,
it just
absolutely.
really
Yep.
nicely lays out
Yep.
the process coming up. Can I ask an additional question about zoning? I think there's some folks here today who might bring forward a specific issue, but I just wanted to ask, we talked about special planning areas, but restrictive covenants, there are communities that have restrictive covenants. Can you just talk about the relationship between restrictive covenants that may exist in some areas and how municipal planning works and how the two are enforced, and do they speak to each other or not?
For the details of restricted covenants, I might look to Tom to provide a little bit more about how that process works, but that is not dealt with by the municipality, so they're not enforced by the municipality. It's a matter of, a legal issue between people in that community, and as opposed to zoning, which is regulated and managed by the municipality. Zoning is intended to be kind of public-facing, public knowledge, kind of established public expectations about what the rules are. And then in terms of how that's enforced, that's conducted by the municipality as well. So especially around the enforcement side, it works a lot differently, and as opposed to the restrictive covenants. We don't go looking in terms of what might exist out there in terms of restrictive covenants to create zoning that may or may not mesh with that. But the municipality does have the jurisdiction and the authority to create zoning that may differ in some ways from the restrictive covenants. And I believe that the restrictive covenants may be able to deal with some stuff that the zoning doesn't, but that's maybe a question for Tom.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So in essence, restrictive covenants generally are prepared at the time of developing a subdivision, and they're intended to apply to all of the development, all of the lots within the development in the same way. So assuming that they're set up legally and properly, the restrictive covenants are enforced by residents against other residents in the subdivision. So if you breach your restrictive covenant, your neighbor could take you to court for a civil remedy. So for instance, if your restrictive covenant prohibited you from operating any type of business within your residence, and you operated an accounting office, there could be a civil action so that you could no longer do that. But that's enforced by the residents of the subdivision, and the municipality has no real involvement in that. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't have zoning, which also prohibits home occupations. So they can mirror each other, but they operate separately. And the issue that we often see from the restrictive covenants is that there's a lack of willingness on behalf of residents to incur the cost to take their neighbor to the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia to seek a remedy because of the cost and the time that it takes. And so often you have restrictive covenants that are ignored. And then there becomes a question of whether they if they're ignored for such a long period of time, can you claim that you are outside the Limitations of Actions Act for the enforcement of those restrictive covenants? So that those are all civil matters that have to be looked at by residents. Oftentimes, depending upon the nature of the neighborhood, everyone respects them and everyone follows them. And in that case, they work well. But they can cover everything from the ability to have clotheslines to outdoor barns and sheds and what those might look like, minimum spaces, like minimum building size for houses. And so, because we had that discussion briefly, if a covenant says you have to have a 1,500 square foot foundation for a property, and you come to us to get a building permit, and it's 750 square feet as a floor plan, we still issue the building permit because the restrictive covenant would have to be enforced by your neighbor or someone in the development. So as Reed has indicated, we don't go out and look for them, and we might not be aware of them, and we can issue something that is contrary to them because we're not a party to the covenant.
Okay. That was a lot of information, but I think very useful. And I said to someone earlier that this is a great reference for those people, now that we have it recorded, for our residents who may want to dig deep into what the zones mean. We can use it as a reference piece. And also for ourselves who may want to go back and watch this again. I think this is quite useful and does help to frame out our understanding. And I hope our residents, as they may look at this, their understanding of what this means and the flexibility that we have over time to add different things and the issues we have to consider. I do want to move on. We have some people in the gallery who've been patiently waiting and also, I hope, learning what some of all of this means. So I would like to open this to public input at this point and invite whoever may want to speak. We use the public input session for our residents to engage and convey concerns they may have or raise questions. If there are questions today that relate specifically to what you've heard, we'll be happy to answer them. Bigger questions that we maybe can't answer today, we'll get back to you. So we just ask that you come forward, give your name and your address so that we have that recorded. And I'll, at this point, invite you to come forward, Mr. Cox, if you wish to speak.
So my name's Tony Cox. I live at 10 Melrose Lane in Middle Cornwall. Most of what I came to learn about and ask about, we covered when it came to the restrictive covenants. But there was an item brought up earlier about privies or outhouses, and I didn't hear what the answer was. But what are the regulations around someone coming in and digging a pit and putting an outhouse there?
Yeah, so I can attempt to answer that. It's regulated by Department of Environment. Mm-hmm. And so the only time that our regulations really interact with that is just, we would say, in some cases, for example, with recreational vehicles, what the way it's written here says that's okay to have that and live there, but you have to have some type of septic system that's approved by Department of Environment. We leave it up to them to determine what can be approved and what not approved, but we know that a pit privy under their regulations is an accepted form of a septic system. Okay. But in terms of how it's constructed or whether it's approved or not, it's over to them to make sure. Yep.
Great, thank you.
Is there anyone else who wishes to speak? Okay, thank you very much. Just in closing, are there any other questions from councillors? I just want to make sure we get those covered. Okay, I don't see anybody. Thank you, Reed and Anna, for that comprehensive presentation. And we do not have any further agenda items today, so the meeting is adjourned.